Lawrence here from Import Export TV at the beautiful offices up here in Sydney of HLB Mann Judd, joined by Paul Damkjaer, the CEO of the newly formed IFCBAA, and Steve Grivas, who is, I've got to get this right, the head of Freight Forwarding and Customs Brokers Industry Group at HLB Mann Judd. So thanks for joining me both.
Pleasure.
Paul, I'd love to start with you to basically set the scene, talk about the backdrop of the last couple of years for forwarders and brokers, and why this report is so important.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lawrence. For the last couple of years, it's at the beginning, say March 2020, when no one really knew what to expect with this pandemic on its way into Australia. But what it has done, it created a lot of opportunities because no one was travelling. Therefore, they was importing leisure goods, people were updating their TVs. So the great amount of cargo that was coming into the country was exponential, never been seen before. And we could see that the data shown by the Australian Border Force with the declarations made into this country, cargo reports, that it jumped something like about 20% in some areas. So a lot of the industry did well. It was a crazy time for a lot, where they were working under severe pressure when there was lockdowns, and they all had to make sure they could work from home. So, but the industry as a whole did very well in accommodating the facilitation of trade into an export out of Australia. So, but it was, I suppose, a litmus test to the fact that the industry is very adaptable.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think the whole sector here across Australia has done an amazing job. This report is really the first of its kind, isn't it?
It is. It's not only a report that just gives you facts and figures and graphs. It actually tells you a bit of a story of what has transpired in the industry. And I must congratulate HLB Mann Judd on this report, because it is a great report. And in the industry, you sometimes make assumptions on what's happening out there, but with this raw data that has come from the industry, some of the assumptions that I personally have made are correct, and some were a little bit off. But in the main, it was a very good report that told a story of how the industry fared during the years of 2020 and 21 and going into the beginning of 22.
Yeah, and I know that the report was released at your recent conference, and the feedback and the comments of the industry was really positive. They were really, as you said yourself, Paul, really sort of surprised at some of the findings, but also confirmed some of their own assumptions.
Yes, it is, and no other report like this has ever been put out to the industry.
Yeah,
that was made by the industry for the industry.
Yeah, and I want to just bring you back a little bit there, Paul, because obviously, it's for forwarders and brokers, the report, which is again a really powerful combination. And tell us, the viewers, obviously, the IFCBAA and that recent amalgamation, because it happened pretty much just at the start of the pandemic.
Yes, it did. In March, in February 2020, we were starting to get things together, and all of a sudden the pandemic was onto us. So that made things hard, whereby we made a decision to go live with the new merger, the new entity, on July the 1st, 2020, and was all stations out to get this done. And with the lockdowns and everyone not real sure what this COVID pandemic was or was going to be, it made it very difficult. But there was a few little hiccups, but we were open for business on July the 1st, 2020.
Yeah, congratulations. I know
Thank you.
It's a lot of hard work, blood, sweat and tears,
Yes.
but it's definitely...
it was a team effort from the IFCBAA administration, and the board did a great job in assisting us as well.
Great. The report itself, it's broken down to a couple of sectors, and I know that with this type of thing, I want to bring you in, Steve, and can you explain how you came up with the idea of the report and how you decided on which sectors to cover?
Thanks, Lawrence. Look, the idea of the report, and first of all, I'd like to thank the International Forwarders and Customs Brokers Association of Australia for working with us in releasing this report. The thinking behind it was really just to provide the industry with a snapshot as a whole as to how the industry has performed over the last 2 years, allow individual businesses in the industry to have a benchmark as to how they are performing and to see how they're performing individually against the industry as a whole, and thirdly to provide our insights into the industry and also try to give a bit of a suggestion as to where the industry may be going forward. So in terms of putting it together, the idea was just to try to help the industry in a sort of unknown period that had just had come through the COVID-19 pandemic, and most people were of the view that businesses would suffer through that period, but I think the report showed a different picture as to how the industry in general coped through that pandemic. So it was just to provide that snapshot back to the industry to see exactly how they performed.
And how long did it take to actually create and develop the research?
We're quite thankful to IFCBAA again in that the large membership base and alongside our clients, we were able to reach most of the members through a survey. And to be fair, there was a large sample of organisations that did respond back to the survey. I would say in total it would have taken about 3 to 5 months to put the report together from initial scoping in terms of what questions we want to be asking the industry, and then asking the industry those questions, and also working with the industry to make sure that they answer the questions.
And that, as you say, the participation by industry was quite strong.
It was quite strong.
Yeah,
The HLB Mann Judd have been involved with snapshots, I would say, in the past of the industry. This was the first full kind of this type of report being released to the industry, and therefore more work was required behind it, and two, the numbers in terms of how many people responded were also a lot higher than the previous snapshots, which was encouraging.
What surprised you the most with the report?
What surprised me the most, I would say, probably how quickly businesses adapted to change, and I think that they needed to in order to be able to continue the excellent work that the freight forwarding and customs brokers industry does at the end of the day.
Paul, back to you. So as an industry body supporting all these forwarders and brokers around the country, I'm sure it gives you, as a body, a great sort of framework to where you can put some resources and some support mechanisms in the future as well. Do you see a lot of value in that?
Yeah, absolutely, Lawrence, absolutely. I mean, the main thing is that we're concerned with in that particular area is the future. I mean, and as we all are aware, there's acute staff shortages at this particular point in time. Will that change in the coming years? Maybe so. But what our mantra is at the moment for this education training system is to get new blood into the industry to entice the school leaver, the year 12 leaver who doesn't want to go to university and wants a career somewhere else. So we have to be on the front foot and the career days, advising school career officers that we exist. I mean, prior to the pandemic, I mean, no one really knew what international logistics was. They just knew it turned up.
Yeah.
But as it was said during this time, it was declared a critical service provider to Australia. Without the trucks, the warehouses, the freight forwarders, the customs brokers, the port workers and all that, who form part of the logistics chain, we wouldn't have survived.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the appreciation of all the logistics service providers has really had their light shone on them over the pandemic, and as you both said earlier, I think everyone stepped up and done a fantastic job in very stressful and challenging times, and with very short labour as well that they're typically used to.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you both, what's been the reception, and I'm sure they're very appreciative, from the government agencies like ABF and others who've read the report, and they have their own internal government reviews and they've got their own data, I'm sure, but to have the industry come together like the way you guys have to really put the feelers out. Have you had some feedback from the government agencies like DOR and ABF and so forth?
Well, I have that. I can see the two main regulatory bodies that our industry deals with is the Australian Border Force and Department of Agriculture, Forest and Fisheries, quarantine. And they recognise the fact that we're an integral part, so were they during this time, and the challenges that we both face, like the onset of working from home because of the lockdowns, had its challenges on both sides, and there was some obviously frustration because there was the amount of cargo that was coming through necessitated people to work extra hours around the clock on the weekends. But both agencies, and that's the ABF as well, was very good, and they understood the crisis that we're going through. I mean, in saying that, if they look back, especially the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries and Forest, they've got some looking, and they are looking at it now. They're definitely looking at it, but it showed up probably some areas that they need to pay more attention to increase the ability to facilitate trade in this country. But in saying that, they've got their duty to perform. Like now, we've got foot and mouth disease, which they're doing a sterling job of keeping out of the country, which we've never had it. Yeah. But there was, the capra beetle, and there's all these other little pests that get in and could wreck the Australian economy through, the agricultural sector. Yep. So, yeah, they got their job to do.
Yep, fantastic. And Steve, I know we'll talk after the break with yourself and Bill, but do you see from the survey parameters, do you want to expand that for future surveys?
That's the intention, Lawrence. I think this was an initial snapshot into the industry, gave the industry a story around how the industry performed around COVID. So it was a little bit unusual circumstances as well regarding the benchmarking report. But the idea is to probably have follow-on questions to some of the questions we initially sort of asked, so that we can get a more detailed sort of response as to how the industry is approaching certain challenges.
Great. Well, thank you both. What I'd like to do is go to a break and come back, invite Bill to join us as well, and we'll go into a bit more granular detail on the report.
Good. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Cheers. Welcome back, everyone. Now we've added to the panel, so we're joined by Bill Nussbaum, who is the Director Tax Consulting and Compliance. Welcome, Bill. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Bill, before we get back into the report, I'd love you to talk about HLB Mann Judd, give the viewers an overview of you guys as a firm, and then I'll ask about both your individual roles.
Okay. So we're a medium-sized accounting firm, and the HLB is our international affiliation, which gives us access to numerous accounting firms around the world under one umbrella. And we have various divisions in the firm. We have Steve works in the audit and assurance division. I work in the taxation accounting division. We have insolvency. We have wealth management, superannuation. All the things. So in some ways, it's a one-stop shop for a lot of things. Insurances, have your wills done. Yeah. But about 10 years ago, because we have a lot of freight forwarding clients, international freight forwarding clients, we thought it would be a good idea to sort of specialise in the area and really to try and maybe also help them, and that's how we developed our relationship first with the other association and now with IFCBAA, the new association. So it's been a very it's been a very good 10 years relationship we've had with the association.
Wonderful. And Steve, with your role, you obviously, both of you are quite heavily engaged with the associations, as Bill mentioned, but it's interesting how you mentioned HLB is a global brand, a global entity made up of multiple firms around the world. How much interest do you get from overseas about setting up shop here in Australia?
It happens quite often, to be honest, Lawrence. I suppose the benefit of being a part of a larger accounting network is the opportunities we get from our overseas HLB officers, either overseas freight forwarders, for example, wanting to set up in Australia, or at the other end where small businesses in Australia are just wanting to set up. So it comes from both the HLB International Network, but also from individuals within Australia that want to set up a freight forwarding or customs broking business at the end of the day.
Great. And Paul, if I can bring you back into that point, because one of the trends that the report highlighted was that there is an increase in M&As, mergers and acquisitions throughout the sector. A lot of bigger companies are being gobbled up smaller companies are being gobbled up by the larger ones. How do you see that trend? Do you think that's going to continue over the next couple of years?
Well, in the last couple of years, it's had a large boom where the M&As have been created, especially from shipping lines, shipping companies that decided to put their foot in the water for being freight forwarding / customs brokers and logistics providers. But in the main, there has been some movement, and I think there will still movement in 2022. And depending on what the economy does in the next 6 to 12 months, that'll determine how these mergers and acquisitions continue.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Bill, what do you see as, from the report, some of the challenges forwarders and brokers may face in the next couple of years?
Yeah, we can go through those in more detail in a minute. But I think we touched on recruitment, staff. I think that's a big factor for not just freight forwarding but a lot of industries. How do we get good staff, especially experienced staff, and how do we keep them? And also, how do we keep our existing staff? Which is very important too, which people overlook sometimes. And I suppose the other thing is what's the future for the freight forwarding? In the report, most companies, over 90% of companies said they made a profit over the last 2 years, and some of them made a very good profit. But as we were talking to Paul before, what's the future going to hold in another 2-3 years? Can they sustain that profit? So that'll be the interesting question. Will that sustain when things come back to normal a little bit?
Yeah. Paul, can I ask you one thing that Bill just mentioned? I remember at your conference you had a statistic about the average age of a broker, which was really surprising, but also a bit of urgency as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting statistics where we gleaned this information from the Australian Border Force, because I was just interested to know what's happening out there in the industry for customs brokers, and the average, and this is probably the most accurate statistical data that we could gather about the age, and it turned out to be about between 54 and 55 years old.
Yeah. Definitely a wealth of experience that potentially is going to drop out of the industry in the next decade or so. Steve, getting back to the granular detail of the report, it's about 9 sectors, isn't it? Or segments, I should say. What made those up, and how did you come up with those 9 segments?
In terms of, I suppose, making up those sectors, it was really what we were seeing with our existing clients, to be fair, Lawrence. We were seeing that they're probably some of the issues or some of the areas where most of our clients, not necessarily facing challenges with, but having areas of concern with. And with working with IFCBAA, we selected those 9 areas being the areas we thought were the most relevant for the industry. The areas where we thought the industry would want to know more about, and the areas where we thought the industry would participate in the survey with as well. So that's how we got to those 9 sectors.
Okay. One thing you mentioned earlier, Bill, it's really important. The decision 10 years or so ago to specialise in a forwarding accountancy firm. What are some of the nuances a freight forwarder faces when their taxes and their reporting, and even recently in the last couple of years, one of the things that, when we were discussing things earlier, and I think it was part of your presentation previously as well, when freight forwarders and brokers were applying for things like COVID support through the federal and state governments, turnovers and differences that they have to do with disbursements versus other type of industry sectors, that specialty and that experience really came into its own. So what are some of the things that a forwarder faces from an accounting perspective and compliance perspective versus other sectors?
Well, so this was a critical issue, and we had a lot of queries about definition of revenue, because all those government incentives were based on what your revenue was. And if you were especially above 50 million in turnover, group turnover, you didn't receive any of JobKeeper or any of the concessions. So it wasn't just JobKeeper, it was JobKeeper, cash flow boost, all of them. So I had some of our clients and also IFCBAA's clients calling me about, we're getting very close to the 50 million, but of course we're including, customs duties and other things in that, and that pushes us over the 50 million. What happens, do we still get it or not? And so we actually approached the ATO, and after a long negotiation, deliberation, they finally came back to us and said that a forwarder can exclude statutory charges like customs duty or GST, which they may pay on behalf of a client, but obviously get it back. It's a reimbursement. But all the other reimbursements, they're all in. Okay, so we got a carve out for those two particular. And so, and the 50 million is crucial because it's not only for JobKeeper. Now, the main issue is the company tax rate. If you're over aggregated 50 million, you've got a 30% tax rate. If you're under 50 million, it's a 25% tax rate. So that's a big difference, And there's a lot of other tax FBT concessions which come with being under 50 million. So it's still an issue, how freight forwarders report their gross revenues.
But that's where that understanding of a forwarder and a broker is so critical, because if you're a generalised accountancy firm, you may not have that direct experience or industry relationships that you do. So
no, because most accounting packages, like CargoWise, everything goes into revenue, and no one even blinks an eye about the revenue numbers. This is what the revenue is. But you need a bit more expertise and to understand what goes into those numbers, and knowing that some of those numbers are really not. It's just a real reimbursement. For a client.
And I know Paul touched on this earlier. We both talked about this merger and acquisition sort of trend. Steve, companies who want to set up here in Australia, the tax landscape, the regulations here are very different to other parts of the world. Again, that specialty in forwarding, logistics, supply chain sector comes into its own, because what you've just discussed, Bill, is just tip of the iceberg stuff. But to set up entities, their labour requirements, work cover, all those type of things. How do you help your global network through HLB navigate the Australian landscape? Yeah,
no, it's a good point, Lawrence. I mean, the Australian landscape is similar in many aspects to overseas, but there are certain areas where overseas jurisdictions just don't have those issues. Bill being a tax expert and me being the audit and corporate advisory expert, we effectively play tag team in helping clients navigate those issues. Bill effectively works out all the tax compliance areas that they need to make sure they're complying with. nuances like employees, payroll tax, and so forth. And my job is to make sure that from a larger sort of perspective, they're sort of complying with the legislation that gives them either the custom broker's license or the freight forwarding background that they need to be able to set up and comply with the Australian regulations at the end of the day. They're quite a lot, so it's not an easy task to set up an Australian business, but Bill and I have done it a number of times to try to make it as smooth as possible for entities setting up.
Yeah, wonderful. Sorry, Bill.
Just on that, we've also got a division, a global accounting compliance division, which helps, companies inbound companies coming into Australia to set up their operations, especially when they first come in, they don't have staff, they may not. So we can set up all their registrations, payroll, we can set everything up for them and help them when they come in. So we've got that experience to do that, because it's sometimes difficult for a multinational coming into Australia. So there's a lot of requirements that they have to, and especially we might touch on that a little bit later if they're an SGE.
Even just as simple as setting up an Australian director.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't know, so we obviously assist in making sure there is an Australian director as well.
Yeah. And Paul, can I ask you, from your experience in the industry, do you see many Australian firms going abroad, or do you see it's more inbound where these SGEs are significant global entities? That's correct, right? So, essentially a big entity coming into town. Do you see that, a question without notice, I'm not sure if you're aware, but what's the makeup sort of ratio between companies coming into Australia versus some of the Australian entities going offshore and setting up their own businesses?
Well, during COVID, you could rightfully say that from what my knowledge is from the industry, is no one opened up anything in the last 2 years anywhere. There has been in Europe and in the United States, there have been mergers and acquisitions made, some very large ones as well. So that hasn't stopped the European companies going forward in the acquisition mode. In Australia, there's been one or two local ones, and that's about it during the COVID period.
Great, thanks, Paul. Just on the SGEs and some of these trends. So we've experienced the last couple of years pandemic. To make things more complicated, we've had, vessels blocking the canals. We've had, obviously port disruptions and incremental weather right across Asia as well, which has shut down some major terminals. So the supply chain sector, has copped it from every angle pretty much over the last couple of years.
Very much so. What could go wrong went wrong.
Yeah. So, as you pointed out before, Paul, that now the appreciation of people in the supply chain sector has never been stronger, which is a positive thing. Where do you see the trends of the next? Well, one, I'll take a step back. Do you see some of these issues being resolved, and some of the shortages of space, high freight rates, shortages of labour? Do you see those being resolved in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, it's a supply and demand thing, where the softening of some of the sea freight rates globally have started to occur. Not in big steps, but it's heading in that direction. With the possibility, there's talk of recessions in the United States and some other countries, and negative growth. And as I've said before, I've seen statistics, data that shows that there is a decrease in the amount of cargo that's being reported into this country, Australia. So I can only assume that's happening everywhere else in the world, and that'll have a flow-on effects on staffing arrangements, profitability. It's again, we've just come out of COVID with one challenge, and then it looks like we're going into another one with the state of the economy globally, and with the just to add some more spice to it, you've got the war in the Ukraine, which is creating a lot of drama in fuel prices, food prices, and above the thing that and it's just one of those things. It's just a domino effect.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Steve, what as a wish list? If I'm a freight forwarder, I used to be a freight forwarder, but if I'm back in the freight forwarder game, what would you recommend and advise me to prepare for in the next couple of years?
Well, there's a few key issues. I think the COVID has definitely shown that freight forwarders need to be nimble and be very adaptive to what's happening around them to be able to stay relevant. But secondly, I think while Paul mentioned the average age of a customs broker and freight forwarders in their mid-50s. So succession planning, I think, is a key area that should really be considered by all freight forwarders and customs brokers. And that's not necessarily to say succession planning is to sell the business, but what are the plans when the current senior managers are no longer there? Have they considered that? Are they bringing in new senior managers to be able to cope with tomorrow's challenges? In terms of operational aspects, I think the accuracy of financial information still is a key issue in freight forwarders. Just the ability to get the correct information on a timely basis will, I think, continue to be an issue going forward. It's something that needs to be worked on. So I think they're probably the main three areas that freight forwarder and a customs broker really should be considering over the next couple, or probably in the next 5 years, I'd say.
Yep. Bill, listening to both of you earlier, one thing that sort of popped in my head was there was an old saying by Henry Ford saying, "I don't need to know everything, I just surround myself with people who do." When you talk about the decision about 10 years or so ago to specialise in the forwarding sector and the brokerage sector, I don't know many other accountancy firms who can actually hang their hat in that and say that we are a specialised firm for that sector. So congratulations on that. How do you describe that to a company coming into Australia who may not have experienced that forwarding expertise before? If I said to you as an elevator pitch, what's the difference between HLB and another big four accounting firm? What would you say from a forwarder or broker?
Well, firstly, I'd say that we have an industry group. We do have an industry group, and we have also many clients in the freight forwarding industry. We have both the big boys, the larger clients and multinational type clients, but I also do quite a few family-based businesses, and their requirements are very different to the larger companies. So we have a good spectrum of freight forwarders, and we've, from 10 years ago, we started off with a good base of companies, and now we've grown that with help of and then we obviously became part of the association. That was critical for us to get more exposure to us. Because nobody knew us 10 years ago. We went to the first conference I went to. They thought HLB was a freight company.
Oh, really?
And but over 10 years, I think everybody now knows us, and that I think we take a genuine interest in the industry. And Steve's the auditor for the association as well. And I get a lot of queries from the IFCBAA, like a help desk. They call me with tax problems or whatever, GST queries, but we're big enough to be able to. We've got the people expertise, whether it's GST or other issues, to be able to help them.
Just to add to that, I think, the fact that we've worked with IFCBAA to release that benchmarking report really does show our, interest in trying to service this industry. It's not about us telling everyone we want to be in this industry. The proof is we've got a partnership with IFCBAA that shows that we are here to work with the industry.
Yeah. And Paul, I think from an association perspective, it gives you an added resource to tap into, as Bill said, if you get inquiries coming.
Yeah, exactly. And as Bill and Steve has mentioned, during the COVID time, a lot of people, a lot of companies just didn't know where to go, and especially when it was to do with our industry. HLB was the one that we always recommended, and as you said, Steve, that they do our auditing, and and they help us with a lot of advice for members.
Thanks, Paul. So, to wrap up today's interview, how frequently can we expect the benchmarking report? And is there something is it going to be a, sort of an annual thing, and is there a certain period before financial year, or what's in the future for the benchmarking report?
I think the initial interest would probably be every 2 years, I think. And then I think once we start getting, I suppose, the more detailed responses into some of the more micro sort of areas, we may then be able to expand it on an annual basis and start repeating maybe questions that were sort of asked a year or two or so ago again. But the initial thinking is once every 2 years, and try to get, I suppose, even though we've had a large amount of organisations respond to the survey, get more on board. The more people that get on board, the more knowledge there is there for the industry to see how they're performing.
Great. Well, congratulations to both of you and the firm for being so proactive and partnering with industry to create such a fantastic report, because, as we discussed earlier, hasn't been done before, especially here in Australia, where we are very different to other markets in the logistics and supply chain sector. So to have something that is specifically for the Australian landscape, it's a huge benefit. And I'm sure, I know from even speaking to other people who are forwarders and brokers, it's, as you said earlier, Paul, it sort of surprised a few and confirmed a few assumptions, but I think it's definitely invaluable, and it gives people a bit of a rudder to steer some of their business decisions going forward. So thanks, Bill, thanks, Steve, thanks, Paul, for being a part of this session, and look forward to seeing the next ones coming out.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you.